Thanks for tuning in and welcome back to the shop. Today, I'm going to do a repair to our 2013 Mitsubishi Fuso Canter that has the potential to save you hundreds of dollars on a repair. If you have underneath your truck, behind the fuel tank, this little box, you have an electric fuel pump. And they are not cheap. MK456242. That's the factory part number for a replacement fuel pump if you're looking for one. Now you might want to sit down before you get the price because they're around $400 Canadian. That's right, inside that little box is a $400 fuel pump. And I thought there's no way that is a $400 fuel pump. It looks like a standard Bosch fuel pump that I've seen on Volkswagen, Porsche, Ford. They're all the same. So I thought I'd take a look around and see what I could find, and lo and behold, on Amazon, I found this. And not only was it easy to get because it was on Amazon, it was about a quarter of the price. That's right, this same Bosch fuel pump, a quarter of the price on Amazon compared to buying from Mitsubishi. I'll leave a link in the description, so if you want one, you know where to get it at the right price. Now, I don't want you to think that I've just grabbed some random fuel pump off of Amazon and I'm going to throw it into this truck. I've already done this repair on the identical truck to this. The previous truck that I was repairing had a catastrophic failure in the Bosch fuel pump. It sprayed fuel out the side and all over the place, and I replaced it with this exact pump. So here's my recommendation. If you live in an area where you have salt on the roads, grab one of these for yourself before you have a failure. Swap it out, maybe keep the old one as a spare. And that's what I'm doing today. And I'm going to show you why the old one had a failure and how to prevent that from happening. For step one, we need to get access to the pump. And that's pretty easy. You got to undo these 4 12mm bolts. Now I've spent a lot of time pre-soaking in PB Blaster, so these should come out fairly easily. You may want to do the same. With the cover off, we can now see the connections to the fuel pump electrically, the mechanical fuel connections, and the fact that this pump is held in a clamp that squeezes the pump. What happens in here is there's a rubber gasket around the pump between the aluminum pump body and the steel mount. You may see where this is going if you've watched previous videos of mine. On this gasket, on the top, there's a gap. So the gasket is formed like this. Okay? And the idea is that it's isolating the aluminum from the steel. Hey, good job, guys. The problem is, with a gap sitting on the top, any salt and salt water can sit in that little gap between the rubber. So there's a little gap here. And that then packs salt, which turns into salt water, sand, anything that gets in there stays packed in that little groove across the top, and you get a huge corrosion cell in between the aluminum of the pump and the steel of the mount. And that's exactly what happened on my last pump. It corroded right through. It had a pinhole in the side of the casing and fuel went everywhere. So what we want to do when we remove this gasket, minimum, put it on the bottom, and that way anything that's in there can drain out instead of being stuck on the top. What I recommend when you put it back together is seal that up with sealant. Silicone, Sikaflex, something that'll come apart again so that no water can get in that gap. The next thing you're going to want to do before you undo the clamp that holds the pump in place or pull the lines off is disconnect the wiring. Underneath these two boots are two very small wire terminals. This is a 7mm and the one in the back is 8. They do not take a lot of torque. For taking apart, it's not a big deal, but if you want to reuse this pump, just be very gentle because it is quite easy if there's a lot of corrosion on these terminals to actually spin the terminal and destroy your fuel pump. So it shouldn't take much to get them going. They're a little difficult because of the boot, probably easier with a socket instead of a wrench, but these are pretty small, so you may not have much choice with the tools you get to use. Before we disconnect the fuel lines, I'm going to recommend you throw a catch pan underneath because there's likely to be some spillage. Also, if you don't like getting diesel on your hands, throw on a set of gloves. And I'm going to suggest you grab a zip tie, and you'll see why in a minute. First, I'm going to disconnect the fuel inlet. Fuel inlet, you want to push in here and then pull back. As soon as you've done that, you want to lift it up, throw a zip tie around the fuel supply line. And what that's doing is it's going to keep this line above the top of the fuel tank. To remove the outlet side of the pump, we want to squeeze this white button in and pull back on the line. You'll get a little bit of fuel leaking here. So again, I'm pushing in on this white button and just wiggling back. Small amount of fuel leaking. Again, I've got the catch pan underneath. So the fuel pump is now disconnected from the fuel system. We're disconnected from the electrical. All we need to do now is actually remove the pump from the bracket. To remove the pump from its bracket, you're going to need a 14mm wrench and a 14mm socket on the bottom. I find it a lot easier using an impact driver. Again, lube up beforehand. PB Blaster is going to make your life easier. There are 2 bolts in this bracket. You can see what I was talking about with, just get this lined up here, that line in between where the 2 halves of the gasket come together. You can actually see there's corrosion and aluminum oxide and pitting already happening on this pump. Okay, and hey, look at that. There's a Bosch part number 0580-464-118. Search that up, see what you find. So again, here's the old fuel pump, and here's the new fuel pump. Pretty much identical if you ask me. Now that we have the pump out, I want you to see a couple of things. One, right along here is where the gap in the gasket was. And what I'm scraping off of here is aluminum oxide. And you can see right here, at least I hope you can see, it's actually gouged down into the fuel pump. There's pitting that's gone right into the surface of the pump. And that's exactly the same spot where the hole started spraying a fine mist of fuel all over the bottom of the last truck. So all I'm doing here is scraping off the powder from the surface. I'll get a close-up of that if I can, but right there, it's probably eaten about halfway through the surface of the aluminum on this pump. So potentially good for a cheap spare, but I'm not going to rely on it. On the other half is the gasket, and you can see all this white powder here and the white powder there. That's aluminum oxide. So that is the surface of this pump, the material that the casing is made of, coming apart on the inside of the gasket. Installation of your new pump is quite simply the reverse of the removal. Keep in mind the flow direction is to go from front to back. The terminals go on the back, and the fat terminal goes towards the chassis and the skinny terminal away from the chassis. Other than that, keep in mind what I was saying about this gasket and where the gap goes, where you want to put some sealant in there. And obviously I'm going to want to paint this before I put it back together, but I can't do that right now because it's too cold in my shop. And that's really all there is to it. It's not that difficult to change out, and it's not that expensive if you know the right place to get it. I highly recommend, at a minimum, you take a look at your fuel pump and make sure you don't have corrosion that's going to cause a trip-ending catastrophic failure. I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, maybe consider giving us a thumbs up. If you've got any questions, throw them in the comments section down below, and I'll do what I can to answer it. If you enjoy this type of content, maybe hit subscribe. There's lots more coming. And until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll see you then.